Okay, so we're going to talk about the register part of the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill, section 436C on page 49. Okay, so the sections are quite short, but the implications are massive. So the first thing, A, child's name, date of birth, home address. Information the local authority already has, because when you deregister from school, the school pass on this information, much the same as the name and address of each parent of the child. However, there is nothing here to explain what to do about an absent parent or an abusive parent or a parent that's a danger to the child. Where are the protections for the child when it comes to the other parent? It also doesn't explain what is classed as the primary parent, for example, the one doing the home educating if the parents are separated or the other parent isn't involved in most of the day-to-day learning. The simple wording here could actually have massive implications. The next section, C, the name of each parent who is providing education to that child. Fairly reasonable, but again, information that they most likely already have. This is where it starts to get really problematic. The amount of time that the child spends receiving education from each parent of the child. Receiving education. That implies being taught. Most home educators don't teach. They're there to provide what the child needs. They're there to facilitate, to support. Very few home educating parents have a structured timetable. They don't have lesson plans. They have some idea of what they want the child to learn maybe, but there's no requirement for that. What works best for each child is different. And to limit those opportunities is quite dangerous. So how do you explain the amount of time each child spends receiving education? So most home educators will describe their learning as being 24/7. Their child is asking questions as they're getting dressed in the morning. They're asking, how does the cereal go soggy in the milk? All sorts of things. They're reading, they're watching a documentary, they're involved in, they might be on a device or drawing. It's all education. This bill implies that education is only the structured learning, which is not part of every home educator's learning. So how do you explain the amount of time? Well, it would be every waking hour for most home educator children, and the authors of this bill clearly don't understand that. And for most of us, we couldn't quantify the amount of hours each parent educates, especially if both parents live at the same house and they're both around, and you're not going to keep those kind of records. You know, you're not going to write down every single day that parent A did 7 hours and parent B did 3, or you're just not going to keep those records, and neither should you. Section E, if the child receives education from a person other than their parent. Let that sink in. From a person other than their parent. They want the names and addresses of any individual and organisations involved in providing that education. That's just part 1 of that. Part 2, a description of the type of each provider. 3, the postal address of each place where that education is provided, if different from the home address, or the website or email address of the provider if that education is provided virtually, the total amount of time that child spends receiving that education, and the amount of time the child spends receiving that education without any parent of the child being actively involved in the tuition or supervision of the child. Whoever wrote this does not know home education. They've not spent a minute with a home educator. How on earth can a home educator provide that kind of information? So in any given day, your child could talk to the postman, the milkman, the neighbour, they could ring grandma, they could be engaged with adult siblings. And that's all before breakfast. They could learn from the librarian. They could go to a museum and learn from them. They could talk to another adult at a museum. They could go to small groups with their friends and an adult be part of the learning. We think that this focus, what they're meaning, is fully structured school type settings, which most home educators don't use. But this section is not worded like that. And as it's currently worded, local authorities will go in, all guns blazing, and demand that level of detail from you. How on earth are people meant to provide this information? The websites used. My kids could use a dozen in an hour, depending on what they were researching or doing at the time. Or did the government actually mean where you are paying a tutor to one-to-one teach your child, or class lessons? Whatever they meant, it's not here. And this is the important part. We cannot have dubious information. We cannot have a bill that can be misused or misconstrued. Local authorities already do this with current guidance, home ed guidance, so goodness knows what they would do with this. This level of detail is not accessible to most home educators. I'm going to leave that at that, but there is more to it, so please watch for the next part.